presence at our Conroy Center, poet and writer Susan Madison. Please welcome Susan.
Thank you. And that was especially lovely coming from Ginger because she actually used to be my boss, and if she could appreciate me and having supervised me, that says a lot. um, I was torn between two poems, and I decided on this one, and I was a little hesitant about reading it because it is a very political and socially charged poem. But I decided to read it because it brought me to tears. And that was one of the criteria that I read something that moved me. The name of it is Black Numerology for Walter Scott. And for those of you who don't remember, Walter Scott was killed by a police officer in Charleston. Black Numerology. Walter Scott, I watched your death hundreds of times. Recently, I counted the steps it took before the eighth shot grounded you. 13. You took 13 paces running for your life in line and online, the warrior stride of a 50-year-old body that died too soon. I wonder how many impressions your feet made before that moment. You probably walked hundreds of miles alive prior to putting numbers on your death march. Countless footsteps covering the earth as a son, a forklift operator, massage therapist, father of four. I wonder how many more miles you would have walked holding your grandchildren.
Thank you, Susan. While we're saying thank you, let's also thank all of the attending board members of South Carolina Academy of Authors, all of our Pat Conroy Literary Center volunteers, our executive director, Jonathan Haupt, this weekend's many sponsors, and tonight's caterer, our dear friend, Debbie Covington. Please be sure to join us after tonight's author presentation for a book signing and reception. As is tradition here at the Conroy Center, our guest author will be signing books at Pat Conroy's writing desk. Charleston native Harlan Greene has written both fiction and nonfiction with a focus on Charleston. His 1991 novel, What the Dead Remember, was honored with the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Fiction, and he was nominated for that same award for his 2005 novel, The German Officer's Boy. As an archivist and historian at the College of Charleston, he has worked to save and interpret the literary heritage of the state, with an emphasis on Jewish history and LGBTQ history. His most recent work, The Real Rainbow Row, Explorations in Charleston's LGBTQ History, was published in 2022 by Evening Post Books. We are honored to host Harlan at the Conroy Center this evening in recognition of his induction tomorrow night into the South Carolina Academy of Authors. Please join me in welcoming Harlan Greene.
So that was me lurking in the side. I am not unconscious of the temperature. I was told that I had an hour. I am not going to keep you to an hour, especially those of y'all as the sunlight shifts. So you'll get to see an act of self-editing, even if it's done, which is what writers need. But want to thank the South Carolina Academy of Authors for inducting me. Although the last time I was threatened with induction, I had to report for a physical and go through, a long line, and that was before the draft board in the 1970s. I also remember when I was on the board of this organization when it first began, and we had some kind of ruckus regarding James Dickey, details of which are better left unsaid. But that triggers even an earlier memory that I had of the first time I saw James Dickey when I was an undergraduate at Clemson. Barry Hanna, my creative writing professor at the time, soon to publish his first book, Geronimo Rex, and enter the Southern literary canon, Barry was in charge of keeping the great poet sober. Let's say that Barry failed gloriously, and a very wobbly James Dickey assumed the podium, and he grabbed hold of the sides of the lectern. He made a few jabbing movements toward us, and he said in a slur, "Remember, writing is something done in the dark, secretly." And then he lurched off for more drinking. So that was my introduction to a great living writer. And even though I was a hippie at a time and had long hair and was ingesting illegal substances, that sort of frightened me. I suppose I was frightened, wondering if that's the price you have to pay to become great. Well, I dodged that bullet by not becoming great. But what he said, I've come to kind of realize is true, that writing, if not done in the dark, secretly, is done in solitary spaces. And I guess it's like being on a dark stage with the spotlight on you. You can't see anyone in the audience, but you kind of sense them out there. Writing, you might think about your readers, but you're not really seeing them. So this now, in this broad daylight, I can see that, wow, after years of writing for readers dimly seen, that y'all are actually here, not on the periphery. So again, thank you for coming. Thank you for reading. Thanks to the Low Country Pride and the Pat Conroy Center and others for sponsoring this. The other person I'll invoke is Pat Conroy himself. I knew Pat only slightly. I mostly knew him through the bookstore that I worked in. And many of y'all here may know that Pat went on the record of saying if there's any South Carolinian literate enough out there to publish a novel, he would blurb it. I never sent him my first novel, but he did blurb my second, What the Dead Remember. And as I said, so forgive the puff, yeah, it had won the Lambda Literary Award for Best Gay Male Fiction. And coincidentally, the best lesbian novel for that year was The Revolution of Little Girls by Blanche McCrary Boyd, also of Charleston, South Carolina. And Blanche is one of the best of the living South Carolina writers. So if there are other board members of the South Carolina Academy of Authors here, I think that Blanche Boyd, anyone who's good enough to win Guggenheim's, write for the Village Voice, Ms. Magazine, and be nominated for the Penn-Faulkner Award, is probably a good candidate for induction in the South Carolina Academy of Authors. She taught Josephine Humphrey, she taught me, she taught Billy Baldwin. So I'm going to get on and off a soapbox this evening, but okay, now I'll get off of that soapbox. Off of Blanche, now back to Pat. So the blurb that Pat wrote on my novel is beautifully crafted, lyrical, and brave. I'll blush at beautifully crafted and lyrical. You know, Pat and I and so many other local writers, you know, there are other writers who've been moved to lyricism that we can try to emulate. And all we have to do is look around and see how lyrically beautiful the Low Country is. But the brave bit, I really don't buy. The book, spoiler alert, is about a coming-of-age novel set in the 1950s of a boy coming to visit his distant family in Charleston. He's introduced to a lot that summer. It's the first time he sees the sea, and it's the first time he understands that he's gay. The book is heavy with the past. I think I liken it to humidity. Maybe you can feel that little thing in the environment now, a presence that weighs on you, that when you breathe and from which there's no escaping. And that presence of the past propels the story. I'd written it in the time of AIDS, and it flashes forward to that time period. And I used history and its burdens as a metaphor for the South and for the epidemic. What you did in the past, perhaps having just one sexual experience, perhaps once enslaving people, could predetermine your fate, your region's fate, from which, like the humidity, there'd be no escaping. I set out to do that lyrically, and perhaps not so heavy-handedly as I've inferred here. Brave it was not. I think Pat used that word because I was writing about gay Charleston, the gay South, AIDS as metaphor for our ancestral sins, and no one wanted to hear those things at the time, and I think he was commending me for that. My first novel, which, if it's not too hot, I'll read from, was published in 1982, Why We Never Danced at Charleston, again set in Charleston about a gay character coming of age in the 1920s and facing the internalized homophobia, a phrase we didn't use back then. And Ned Grimke, the main character, is based on a real Charleston artist named Ned Jennings. The book got a nice review in the New York Times. It was an editor's choice, but Charleston was too well-bred to notice it, and it censored the local review. So Pat maybe thought I was being brave to keep on writing, but I wasn't. The idea with readers in the periphery of my vision while I was writing, but even so, it never occurred to me not to write at gay characters, not to disguise them, not to write in code, wink, 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 and kind of Uncle Tom my way into the Southern literary establishment. And that sure did work. Charleston and the Southern literary establishment or mafia certainly ignored me. And I got praise, I got awards, but Southern writers were not going to open their doors to a Charleston gay Jewish man whose parents were Holocaust survivors. And they had others with much more Southern accents and more Southern lineages to let in. The South has cliches of rootedness, of belonging, but my books and novels, I think, are about the longing to belong, the desire to fit in, and the price you pay for the price you could pay if being Jewish, if being gay, if being different, if you sold your birthright for a mess of pottage to belong to a society that did not want you. So despite the rootedness of Southern literature, the outsider, if you will, haunts Southern fiction too. I think specifically of like Harsha McCullers as outsiders. Being an outsider, I think, was good for me. While my novels kept me outside, my nonfiction, to some extent, got me in. So long before my exposure to Barry Hannah, my first creative writing professor, Wendy Salinger, who some may remember here, and Blanche Boyd, I read Charleston writers who used Charleston as a setting. I read DeBose Hayward, I read Josephine Pinckney, I read John Bennett, all safely dead and all now safely in the South Carolina Academy of Authors, and I took some inspiration from them. I'm also the one who stalked Nancy Thody on the internet and finally tracked her down to tell her how important I thought her mother, Ann Head, is. And forgive me, Nancy, for the ordeal I put you through for that. Because all those writers were gone, I thought it would be easier to steal from them. You know, maybe I could read their pages and see how they used that city we had in common. And I actually think I wrote the nominating speech for the inclusion of Josephine Pinckney to this academy. And so learning about them set me to writing about them. I did a biography of John Bennett, essays about the Charleston Renaissance, lots of books about Porgy and Bess, and people were much more willing to accept me as a historian than a novelist. Because a historian, I was lauding the Low Country, but a novelist, I was not. And thank you for giving me the opportunity for pondering this. I think that's been the cusp, the pivot to aggrandize it somewhat, the pivot of let my writing career, such as has been balanced. I'm Gemini by birth and by nature. I find myself teetering back and forth between fact and fiction, history and fantasy, but each dedicated to their own kind of truth. So with apologies to you, Pat Conroy, not brave in the least. It would be betrayal not to express the truth in yourself and what I saw around me. So in my 20s, researching the 1920s of the Charleston Renaissance, I heard the story of a gay Charleston artist who killed himself in 1929. I was always looking for ancestors and antecedents. I had no Southern ones. All my grandparents had died in the Holocaust, so I looked for those to whom I could be a literary heir. No one could tell me the truth about Ned Jennings. No one dared whisper that he was gay, but I can intuit that he was by reading between the lines. So not knowing the facts, I had to make up a novel about him and change his name to Ned Grimke. He was tragic. He could not speak. A cleft palate left him unable to be understood. So he expressed himself in these magical drawings of his, lyrical, terrible, and fantastic. And to pay my literary debts, I was going to read a letter of John Bennett that set my imagination whirring, one that I read in the archives and here's self-editing at work. It was an amazing letter, and I will say from that letter, from the way John Bennett talked about how this man had staged his suicide. He was found in the Confederate home. He'd broken up with his boyfriend. They found him the next day in the Confederate home with masks that he had made all around the room, with a Bible in his lap, an empty champagne bottle, and the revolver that had fallen from his hand. He had really staged his own suicide, trying to tell Charleston, that he was caught between the biblical prescriptions of the Bible, the champagne glass, trying to tell him to enjoy life, and Charleston and society gave him the only way out with the gun. So I thank John Bennett for giving me that story, and for Miss Laura Bragg, who had mentored Ned Jennings and who ended up mentored me. She told me that, Ned Jennings did not kill himself, that he'd been murdered by the Savannah puppeteer. I had never heard anything quite as gothic as that. And so then that's what set me to writing that book. So again, literary depths, I have to thank Laura Bragg, who for setting me off on that thing too. It's said that writers repeat themselves, and we repeated endlessly. And I did it with my third novel, The German Officer's Boy, again based on a real person really far from the Low Country. Briefly, world history changed in 1938 when a young Jewish boy from Poland, the 17-year-old Herschel Greenspan, went into the Paris embassy and killed a diplomat, Ernst von Roth, over Germany's treatment of Jews. Hitler used that as an excuse to launch the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht, and the Holocaust began. So because of my parents' history, I'd been reading books about the Holocaust, and back in the 1980s, I read in a footnote that Herschel claimed he was gay, and that Ernst von Roth had been gay too, that they had been lovers. He said that to Hitler's henchmen when he was in a concentration camp. Herschel stood up to Hitler and suddenly made what seemed like a chance to turn the world against the Jews. Herschel turned it into a kind of a Montague and Capulet love story between a gay German and a gay Jew. I thought that was really interesting. But historians in whose ranks I wanted to belong, they denied it. They believed that it made Herschel less of an innocent victim if they tarnished him if he was gay. And they said Herschel only made that up to say it to Hitler and to depoliticize the crime. They said, in a word, that he was being brave, but not telling the truth. Well, I've never found being gay or telling the truth embarrassing. So what could I do? I don't read German. I couldn't go to Germany to do research. My beloved partner, Olin Jolly, was living with AIDS. So what were my choices? I could tell Herschel's story as fiction, like I had Ned's, but I could make him gay and speak his truth. I got a major New York editor to accept that book, but then he told me he had to backtrack. He said he was threatened with being fired. If he published the book saying that Herschel was gay, that wasn't a way of Holocaust denying. That was in the 1990s. It was only published about 10 years later, in 2005, by a university press. It slipped from view, and I tried to rescue him from oblivion and tell his truth, lyrically as I could. Years later, though, I got an email from a woman in Australia who had spoken to her rabbi about the book, and he told her that she should contact me. She did. Her mother was a cousin of Herschel Greenspan's. She told me. The family said that indeed Herschel had been gay. It was known to everybody. So I thank her. I thank Herschel Greenspan for allowing me in fiction form to tell the truth that historians did not want to hear. Over the years, I wrote another biography of a gay writer who lived in Savannah and Charleston who'd been forgotten. And I find myself always wanting to rescue the minor people, the forgotten, the misunderstood, those on the margins, perhaps a little bit like me on the outskirts looking in. So I'm now a book about my final book, a history book full of facts that people wanted to deny for centuries. In 2006, there was a controversy over advertisements that appeared in the London tubes, trying to get LGBTQ travelers to come to the United States. Some of those banners said, New Orleans is so gay, San Francisco is so gay, and there was one banner that said South Carolina. is so gay. It gave the legislators in Columbia apoplexies. A shame they were not fatal. Sorry, but they were mad enough to fire the employee who had spent $5,000 to add income to our billion-dollar tourist industry. Those legislators denied South Carolina ever having been gay, that there had been gay people here, and pretty much flat out said gay people were not welcome in South Carolina. Well, that pissed me off, and anger, like anything else, is a good enough prompt for writing. It wasn't right away, but it led to that book. It's fact-filled, it's not fantasy, and enough time had passed that I could tell the stories of my predecessors, my spiritual ancestors, if not my genetic ones. I could claim them for my South Carolina Southern heritage, LGBTQ men and women who had been here for centuries. So in this book, I finally get to tell the truth about Ned Jennings. I also get to tell the truth about Miss Bragg, who told me that story. And it's almost been 50 years since I started writing and being ignored. But for the past 50 years, I've seen history shift. And at times, as witnessed by this evening, it's a tad more welcoming, a little bit more inclusive. And that a young man like Marcus Amaker is being included, sorry, Billy, with us old gray heads and dead heads, it's really nice to see. And frankly, I think awards like this should really go to youngsters. It can make so much more of an impact on their, on their careers. So off the soapbox again. But I'd heard that this was being also sponsored by the Low Country Pride, and I was hoping that there'd be a larger turnout here, but hopefully that most people here would agree that it is not brave, despite what Pat Conroy says. It's not brave at all to tell your truth. Some of it may be lyrical, some of it maybe not. It's a betrayal not to tell your truth. So I'm going to look at my watch, see how long y'all have suffered. I'll read a little bit from one of my books or so, because I think, writers can write and talk about them, but I think ultimately it's the writing itself that has to be judged. So if you will indulge me, I'm going to read a little bit from my first novel, Why We Never Danced at Charleston. And this is, and sorry, it's about the heat, so I hope it doesn't make you hotter. Let's see. So this was kind of my approach to try to get into the Southern literary canon. So this is Charleston, about 1906. Like every summer, heat had laid its siege, and people refugeed as they had after Fort Sumter. They went to Flat Rock and to the mountains of North Carolina, as my family and I did usually. But that summer, the summer Ned and I first met, my grandmother lay ill, gasping for breath, like a mullet out of water, in a shuttered upstairs room. I tiptoed up to the doorway to listen to her inhales and her gasps, as if they were the pronouncements of some deity. Da would shoo me away if she saw me playing with my puppets in the doorway. I had several. The gendarme my grandmother had given me was the angel of death. He's coming for her, I told Da. Boy, she warned, don't even think those things. She was scared of my puppets and glass-eyed doll babies. Often the doctor would appear. In a gloom that gripped the house as tensely as hands held in prayer, my parents spoke to him in whispers and interpreted every tiny change. Was it a sign that the end was near, or did it signal a rally? They could not tell top from bottom in their weariness, and so they felt cross and guilty in the heat. Lost in the shuffle of emotions, I slipped through people's fingers. Da, my black nurse, and that was their generic name, Da being an African word for mother, one that best summed up their tragedy, that of those black women doomed to raise white babies. Da took me out for walks once in a while, and she spent most of her time with my sickly brother Hal, who had been born in April, so I was free to wander the city. I found Charleston a ghost town that summer, the houses hollow and the streets empty. The Charlestonians who could just went to cooler places before air conditioning. The fact that we were left in town and were from Savannah was not lost on the other families. Grass grew up in the streets, and every afternoon the streetcar came by, depositing my father for his dinner, which we ate at 3, cold potato salad, cutlets and shrimp, tomato sandwiches, okra or green beans. While we ate, The shutters of the nearby houses rattled like dice in the breeze, and petals of overblown roses fell in green gardens abandoned to the ravages of creepers and ivy. The talk was sparse, mostly of my grandmother, what she had eaten that morning, and of the stranger's fever that had appeared here and there in the black sections of town. Passing a shack on the way home, my father said he heard a scream and a black woman's malarial delirium. New York, she had cried, New York City. Later, every afternoon, purple storm clouds came up from the sea, and it rained, and thunder boomed in the deserted streets. The old roof tiles were washed in a rainbow pigeon-like sheen. On Sundays, we would hear St. Michael's chime throughout the whole city. Time was a tunnel I entered that summer, like the one I entered under the cool trees of Broad Street, to be passed through listlessly until September would bring its storms, and October would arrive, leading people back to the city. It was halfway or so through that tunnel of summer. I think the hurricane lilies were out, and wisteria was blooming again, when my mother came looking for me one morning with a false brightness in her voice, as if she were just suggesting something to which she had been forced to concur, that I go off and visit Ned Greene. So that's the South, Charleston in the heat. Sorry to do that too. And I'm debating whether to put you through more of this or to, I'm trying to see, more. Okay, so I will read briefly. I will read briefly as to why that I think was my attempt. I can see now of getting into the Southern literary canon, and I think this is why I did not. So this is set in the 1920s. It's young men who've just come back from the St. Cecilia Ball, which is the debutante ball in Charleston. Up in his room, we loosened our ties and collars and removed our coats. We just lounged for a while, smoking cigarettes, feeling relieved not just from the constraints of our jackets and sashes and ties, but from all formality. It was all we drank, I guess. Swinton wound up the gramophone and put on some records, and silly Dwin pranced around in his underwear like a lady. The champagne was open and we toasted. We raised our glasses to beauty. Dwin fluttered his eyelids, pursed his lips, and moved his eyes and heads and hands like Theda Bara in some movie. He blew kisses and we howled. Somehow it wasn't stupid. Somehow it wasn't silly. It was exhilarating. Dwin dropped down on the bed with his legs jackknifing in the air. Hillary jumped on top of him. Swinton almost collapsed in laughter, and then I snapped down the window shade so quickly it sounded like a pistol shot. The gramophone stuck, and Swinton lifted the needle. The silence was unsettling. Dwin and Hillary jumped off the bed as if they were on fire. We were only kidding, Dwin said nervously. Hillary chimed in, we were only kidding. I looked at Swinton. He was in medical school and had been in love once, the details of which he guarded zealously. He held up his hand and said, well, I guess it's time to spill the beans. He was splendid. He was our best looking. Well, I asked. He seemed to be thinking. He looked from Dwin to Hillary and back again. They were looking for cracks in the bedroom floor through which to disappear. Only a fool could not have seen that they were lovers. I mean, in love with the moon and each other. How long they had hid it from themselves. How long could they hide it from their city? It's okay, Swinton said. I know y'all weren't kidding. We certainly were, Dwin insisted indignantly. Hillary agreed. Oh, don't worry about it. Admit it, Swinton said softly. He wound up the gramophone and poured the rest of the champagne. Let's have a good time. He tossed his drink down and gagged when he saw his wristwatch. Oh my God, it's late. We got up and started undressing. Better get cracking, he said, tapping me. He got stuck and tripped out, getting out of his pants legs. Hurry. I don't think any of us really wanted to go out into the cold early morning, but it was such an ingrained habit as to be almost automatic. Before the ball, we had brought our old clothes over here to change into. It was as much as a ritual as the St. Cecilia itself. After the dance was over and the ladies went home to discuss their beaux, it was time for us to discuss them when we went duck hunting. I don't know. Perhaps you can go down the streets today and see the ritual still continuing. Find boys along the curb, drunk and clinging to the lamppost, waiting for their rides to come. Ours came late that night, after 2:30. We climbed like zombies into the back of Alfred's car and drove what was considered fast in those days, careening through those funny Indian named towns, occasionally grinding to a halt to leap out from the back rumble seat and pee on the great silent boles of the black oaks that twisted and lifted their mossed and massed branches up away from the indignity. That night was cold and waked us. The moon was spectral. We roared down the road like a rumor, singing spirituals, screaming in gullah, and drinking toasts to certain ladies. It was about an hour later that we pulled up at the creek. In the plunging dark and chill, we rattled over the narrow plank dock, our laughter rising in the blackness. We went down to the bateau. We rowed over the inky water. We rowed into the palpable blackness. And just our luck, or was it? I now think the other boys must have sensed our difference and allowed us our own company. By the time we reached our blind, we realized it was just us four, Swinton, Dwin, Hillary, and me. We settled down quickly and wrapped ourselves in blankets. No one spoke but Swinton. I think we should organize a group, he said to us. I think we should have regular meetings. But we already belonged to so many different organizations, some to the St. Cecilia, all to the Press Thematic, and others to the Sons of the Revolution. Hillary was in the St. Andrews, Dwin belonged to the League of Decency, and Swinton was a member of the Huguenot Society. There's always room for another, Swinton said, and besides, I want to be president. We accused him of empire building. Not at all, he disagreed. What would you call it? He answered too quickly for it to have been spontaneous. He must have been pondering it for quite a long while. The Sons of Wisteria Society. What a peculiar name! What would be its purpose? To understand ourselves and to help others too. It sounded ominous to me. Maybe it was because our hangovers were beginning to set in, or maybe it was because we ached with cold and dampness, but after that no one said a thing. Swinton produced his flask. He passed it and I pulled from it. I handed it back. This do make me amorous, Swinton said, laughing. Wants to make me go out hunting, and I don't mean ducks. How about you? He looked to the other blinds and winked. Then he offered the flask to Dwin. Dwin pursed his lips and said, no, thank you. Disapproving, he said, it wants to make you silly. Oh, shut up, Swinton snapped. Don't talk to me that way, Dwin answered. You sound like an old maid, Swinton barked. Dwin made a sound and Swinton turned on him. And speaking of that, he asked, when are you going to get married, huh? You're too old to be a bachelor. He was quick as gunfire. How about you, Hillary? I had never seen him this way before. It was frightening. I haven't found anyone to ask, Hillary answered in a meek voice, and Swinton's laugh was ugly. That shushed us. We sat silently in surprise, roused from sleep. Fog eddied about us, touching us like Jacob's angel. The water rippled and the marsh grass swayed and stirred mysteriously. It seemed the sun would never rise. From the other blinds we could hear tales of colored women to be bought and for whom to ask for and how much to pay in certain alleys. We heard laughing. The boys in those blinds were free to see themselves as the bloods of the town, and they did, and they bragged of their bastards. They broke out laughing, they the cream of the aristocracy. Snobbery had nothing to do with sex, unless they committed to what we couldn't and settled down and got married. Oh, those stories. I tried not to hear them. Over the years I had listened to my fill and had fabricated my own. They were prerequisites to our standing. Like stigmata of my shame, my palms started to sweat and Lila Lassane's eyes haunted me. I remembered Ned Grimke. Just then more laughter rose up like a covey of quail on wing. Hearing it in the darkness made me depressed. And just like my feet were in the frozen mud, my courage was sinking. Sound was all we had. The moon had set. And in that bit of unearthly stillness, there was nothing but our own breath in the darkness. Swinton spoke in a new voice, abandoned by both courage and whiskey. I'm sorry I snapped, he said. I owe you an apology. But there's something I've been meaning to tell you all, he continued. It's about us, he stressed, and them. He jerked his head in the direction of the laughing. What about us? Dwin asked. We're different. Oh, no, we're not, Dwin cried. He was still angry with Swinton. We're just as good as they are. Our families. That's not what I mean. Swinton's voice shook like a singer at his first concert. With nervousness, he lectured us for a while, and I'm glad it was dark, for I would not have been able to meet his eyes. I could not believe what he was saying. It was as if he had pinned back the top layer of my skin to reveal my hidden secret. What he said smacked of medical textbooks he'd been reading. I flushed with shame and whiskey as that dread revelatory word fell amidst us. I felt like vomiting. We could invoke it and shape it, but speaking it was taboo. It would be telling. You have to understand that in those years were simpler. Negroes were colored and Jews Hebrews, and without words for such things, we felt they could not be realities. When Swinton said it, I felt as if a rifle had gone off in my hand and I'd been shot. No one could know. My senses spun and I gasped as if drowning. It summoned up visions of intestines and sounded like an unclean disease. I almost wet my pants when Swinton said homosexuality. I was so terrified by it that it took me several minutes to realize that he was not pointing his finger at me. He was not singling anybody out. Instead, he'd said we were all in the same league. He himself was confessing. Meanwhile, shame like hot secretions swept through me. No reason to get alarmed, he said. We're not evil. He looked at our averted faces for support. Look at me. What's wrong? We're not, truly. But we could not look at him. It helped Swinton. It helped for Swinton to say those things, but it was useless. We all believed that we had been told what each of us had learned years before from our DAs, our preachers, our families. I trusted more in their words and ideas than my own feelings. I knew I was damned. I was convinced of it. My conscience resounded with things like defiled and unclean. Terms sprang to mind from King James's vocabulary. Like fishhooks, their ideas worked into me. We're just different, Swinton said. He caught himself on a note of hysteria and brought his voice down. Soon he was relaxed, and you'd have thought it was about the cut of our trousers he was speaking. We're no worse than some, and much better than others, he said, just like any other minority. But Dwin couldn't take it. He stabbed at the dirt and kept stabbing a stick in it. It's not fair, he choked. He broke the stick in half and collapsed on his knees. I knew how he felt and would have comforted him, but what he had just heard, I was scared to touch him. He just wanted to be like everyone else and was too much of a Charleston boy not to be scared of minorities. So it was a great relief to write about that in the 1920s as fiction because I did not know it, and then to be able in the 2020s to actually write a book about the real Rainbow Road, to actually talk about the presence of LGBTQ people here in Carolina in the 1500s. Forgive me as I do. So, in 2006, the state legislature said South Carolina had never been gay. And ironically, maybe you all know this, as the Spanish moved through the Santa Elena area, what they called Florida at the time, the images that they saw were of indigenous people. And the indigenous people were so different from anything that they saw, they were today that we would call gender fluid. So that literally the very first images that went from the old New World into the Old World were the etchings of indigenous people, of men who looked like women, who did women things too. So ironically, there were LGBTQ people in this neighborhood long before there were Europeans. So this book goes from the 1500s, makes a lot of skips and jumps, but then goes up into the 18th century, the Revolutionary War, those who fought in the Civil War, and really starts focusing on the 20th century as well. And so, like I said, it was really great to be able to tell their truths in a nonfiction format versus the fiction format. So I'd be glad to take your questions about anything that I did or did not say. And now I'm very thankful for this breeze, and again, very thankful for y'all all coming. So while I'm up here, the floor is yours if you want it, or otherwise, yes, ma'am.
What's next?
Two literary biographies. One of Dorothy Hayward. Again, we all know about DuBose Hayward and George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin supposedly writing Porgy and Bess. You will be shocked to discover that the one woman who had one of the most primary roles in the creating of that opera has been written out of history. So here I am writing her back into history, and then helping Nancy Thody with the biography of Anne Head. So they're the next two people coming down the line. So again, the people that have been forgotten and marginalized for no good reason. Someone's got to speak up for them. Yeah. Well, yes, ma'am.
The reaction of other historians, people in
The real Rainbow Road. So the question was, what are the reactions within scholarly presses? So there is a review that will appear in like 4 years in the South Carolina Historical Magazine. It is a positive review. The author sent it to me. It's again, I hate to be negative, but this is the first book written on a topic in 350 years of the city's history, and I still say that people just don't want to know that it's there, which to me seems incredibly silly in 2024. But I'm glad to say that it is taught, in academic, college classrooms use it, that kind of thing. So, I'm very grateful for that. But again, I think scholarly reviews come out very, very slowly. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You say that you disagree more or less with when Pat told you that
It was brave.
it was brave.
Uh-huh.
I totally disagree with that. Listening to that excerpt that you just read, regardless of whether you're gay, straight, bisexual, whatever, it takes a lot of bravery to look at your feelings and dissect them layer by layer. Very few people can do that.
Well, I thank you for that. I have to say that I'm very
In 1980.
right in '84, I think, when this came out. And again, it had gone the publishing route for years because, again, people did not want Southern and that. But anyway, I was very fortunate, to have parents. And I think, and forgive me for those of y'all who do fit in, it's always been my contention that the fact that I did not fit in was the best thing that ever happened to me, because you always have to swim upstream. If you're a minority, you're always going against the grain, and it's just too damn easy. If you're born white and elite and you're living in a white elite society, you don't have to develop a conscience. You don't have to think for yourself. So I was very fortunate with my parents, that I thought, well, they went through World War II in Germany. I can be gay in Charleston in the 1960s and 70s, and so then I really did learn by example, and I think so many of us do. It was subconscious, and again, my parents understood what it was like, and when I did come out to my father, who was much more traditional than my mother, I could tell to him, well, Sam, you understand what Nazis said about Jews, and you knew all that was BS. So why can't you believe the same thing? What your straight friends say about, at this time, gay or queer people, the word we said back then. So yeah, it's all BS. And that was a good enough argument. But no, thank you for those kind words. But I do have to share those words with my actual. I say I'm always looking for ancestors. I did have my parents, and I was very fortunate in having the parents that that I did have, and that I still have, somewhere, in my psyche. Yeah. So.
Did you say a little bit about the self-guided walking tour that you put together for correspondence with Philip?
So interestingly, y'all are from Beaufort. Tourism is a mixed bag. It's our economy, but it affects our way of life. So interestingly, Charleston, as you always hear, is number one on the Condé Nast thing of small cities. So X number of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, it was knocked off number one. It was number two. And I asked, why was Charleston not number one anymore? And what they told me to explore Charleston was, one, there was not enough public transportation, and two, Charleston was not perceived as being LGBTQ friendly enough. So I thought, ooh, I could help with that. So, years ago, I'd actually helped Explore Charleston, believe it or not, write a Black history tour, for this webpage, so that when Black tourists come to the city of Charleston, they can say, wow, they've been progenitors here as well. So for Explore Charleston, I did do, there's a real Rainbow Road tour on that as well too. And I'm not saying that I got Charleston back number one, because it is a mixed blessing to have all those tourists on the street, but it did go back to number one. So at least they addressed that kind of thing. So again, it's interesting to note that, that a positive aspect of LGBTQ life is actually now impacting the economy, in the city of Charleston, despite tearing down those banners in the London Tube in 2006. Maybe South Carolina can be a little bit more welcoming. to LGBTQ tourists and interests, and maybe even natives, and those secretly in the State House, But anyway, names shall not be mentioned. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for indulging me. I'd not read my novel in years, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to go back and say, well, it's not that bad, and stuff like that. But again, thank you all for coming, and I think there are refreshments over there.
Thank you.
So thank you all.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Best words yet. Oh, thank you. Okay. In the air conditioning, I have no plan. Yeah, yeah.